Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Munro Live. Today we're looking at the Maverick. So I'm your host, Goose. I'm joking, it's a Top Gun reference. Jordan Arocha here with Munro, and we're going to be walking through some of the things that we found in the underbody. The moral of the story, I'll give you kind of the bottom line up front. Incredibly inexpensive in terms of not just the vehicle MSRP price, but based on the components that we're seeing on the underbody. So I'll highlight some of those as we go along, as well as some of the interesting things that I saw in terms of their execution with heat recovery, some of the impact related things, and maybe how they're keeping away from some of those internal costs. So if we start at the front here, one thing is we're seeing like an old school electric water pump, right? So it doesn't look like a conventional water pump that you'll see on a BEV, which are typically injection molded, vibe welded together, ultrasonic welded together water pumps. This one's a little bit more heavy duty, likely because it's serving dual purpose, not just for maybe some of the electrified components, but this one on the contrary is actually cooling an ICE engine. I know we don't get a lot of those in here these days, but that's why the diameter of this hose, the pump itself, those are pretty robust systems. And although in many ways this is more like a car than a truck, in that it is a unibody and not a body on frame, it's still expected that this thing is going to probably be used in a utility fashion, towing, things like that, which if you get into towing, the thermal management system and cooling, that's going to be a big function, or a big focus rather for Ford. So the other thing, right, that makes this vehicle really inexpensive, or I'll say the first thing that we're pointing out that makes this thing affordable to Ford and therefore the consumer, is one of the features that sort of tipped me off here. This feature in the bottom of the oil pan, so like this kind of pass-through arc section, that is provisional for other applications. So they're probably using, they probably make 5 million of these ICE motors every single year. And so on other applications, they're passing through an exhaust or a prop shaft, something like that, which is why that's still here. So they're probably paying very, very little, relatively speaking, to get this powertrain or power plant in the vehicle. So the other thing, super inexpensive and relatively simple execution, is this front cradle. So if it's all of this black weldment that I'm pointing out here, they've got a long stamped steel clamshell welded member that runs to the front corners of the vehicle. If you've watched the videos before, you know we typically mention some SORB countermeasures, which is small overlap rigid barrier, conducted by IIHS, which is the International Institute for Highway Safety. So they found that a lot of impacts happen in roughly 25% of the overall vehicle width. This member happens to fall within that 25% overall vehicle width. And so what's happening is they're using this member to help start absorbing energy before you even get to the wheel envelope or anything like that. They're starting to load up the cradle. And then on the back side of the cradle, I'm seeing further evidence that they're transferring load to the cradle because these double shear brackets right here. One, the fact that they're there suggests that they're reinforcing both the joint from a stiffness perspective, but also when we see these little keyholes cut out at the leading edge of a bolt, right? So you've got your bolt here, and then you've got this keyhole form around it. In an impact event, that joint is going to separate, and it's going to allow the bolts to pass through that window, thus allowing the powertrain to sort of dive and dip under the vehicle. So what that buys you in a crash scenario is more free crush space. So the further or the longer amount of time within an impact event that you can avoid having a hard point stack up, meaning this immovable object collides with the next one, collides with the next one, meaning they're not going to compress, the better off you are. So them allowing this whole thing to shift back and down is a great thing. Further evidence of that strategy can be seen, Eric, if you shift around the outside here, there's a very, very deliberate like window or like a V format behind the primary rear attachments of the cradle. And what that's doing is it's giving clearance for this right here. So this post on the cradle, I'll use my laser pointer, that post on the cradle to not collide with anything immediately in the rear, causing that cradle to hang up. So those couple of enablers, in addition to the member that we were talking about in the front of the vehicle, really speak to how this entire monument is going to slide rearward. Now, getting back to the cost-saving element, obviously stamped steel weldment, very inexpensive. But even on like the half shafts or the output shafts for the driveline, right, we're not seeing any e-coat, any paint, anything. You can see this is a brand new vehicle, and we've already got surface rust forming on the half shafts. Generally not a big deal. It's going to be a long time before that becomes a structural and therefore safety concern for the driver. That we've even seen expensive vehicles do that, but again, they're taking every opportunity they can to cut costs where possible. Looking at the knuckles and the suspension system overall, they've got McPherson strut, meaning no upper control arm. It's the strut that allows it to pivot and rides the suspension travel up and down, right? So it's one contiguous unit from the bottom of the strut all the way to the shock tower. Tie rods, the inner tie rod ends, the outer tie rod ends, these two monuments which connect to the rack inboard of vehicle, they're all just black paint. I don't even know that they're e-coated, in fact, based on the surface rust that we're seeing. So as I'm walking through this, hopefully you're getting the sense that they're not spending a lot of money in premium materials. In fact, the only area that they really are on the front end of the vehicle is this lower control arm. But I would bet every last dollar that this lower control arm was not purpose-built for this application. I would submit that they are likely using that lower control arm from something else in their portfolio. So same thing like with the motor, they're capitalizing on the volume. They don't have to retool up for it and then amortize those costs throughout the life cycle of the program. So good strategy to cut costs if you're a large company like Ford. As we move rearward, obviously we've got a tunnel in this vehicle because it's an ICE application. Here's your catalytic converter, and they've got another catalytic converter upstream more than likely, because I'm not seeing up and downstream O2 sensors, which on modern applications, it's not just sensing air. In fact, what those sensors are doing in ICE applications is on startup, you know, if you're familiar with open and closed loop, on startup, they need to heat those catalytic converters as fast as they possibly can so as to mitigate emissions. So what they'll do is they'll dump a bunch of air and fuel into those catalytic converters, and then they want to ignite them so that those get red hot immediately. So the O2 sensors are not just sensors, they actually ignite that air fuel mixture in the catalytic converter, thus bringing it up to the temperature so as to mitigate emissions on the back end. But again, here, this may be a second or a downstream catalytic converter, but it may not be the primary, because again, I'm not seeing those O2 sensors, which are almost always, or they will be, right, upstream, in some cases midstream and downstream of those catalytic converters. Above the exhaust system, we've got a lot of aluminum heat shields here as we move rearward. This is really interesting, right? So I've got this kind of interesting little module here, which I'll explain in a moment, adjacent to their little battery pack. So underslung battery pack, we see they've got this steel bar to mitigate impact, to protect the battery pack depending on what terrain you're traversing. So back to this exhaust module though, as it correlates with the battery we were just talking about, this is an exhaust or a heat recovery system. So what's happening is obviously your exhaust is going to be quite hot, but you also in some cases, when the exhaust is hot in the wintertime, for example, want to bring the battery up to temperature. So if you've got a battery electric vehicle, you need a PTC heater, a dedicated module that's going to heat up the coolant in the system using the battery's energy to then heat up the battery. Now this, it's not entirely free. There's always a energy medium transfer penalty in terms of efficiencies, but you're recovering the heat from the exhaust system via this exchanger You're transferring it to the coolant via these hoses, and then these hoses right here are going to be plumbed to the battery, even potentially even some of the other high voltage modules and or the cabin heater. I'm not actually sure where else they're going to, but certainly they're going to use that to aid in the warming of the battery pack during certain cold conditions. On the left-hand side, we've got the vapor canister with a few vapor traps and different solenoids to actuate when you go into a regen cycle for this system. So they're determining, based on all the stuff in the charcoal canister, when they want to dump that back into the system so as to burn those off, again, from an emissions perspective. As we move a little bit further rearward, we've got the primary muffler in the system, and then the primary resonator is just downstream. So going back to the cutting cost thing, again, pretty hard to miss the fact that we've got rust spot, surface rust all over the surface of this. This is something that you'll absolutely not see on a brand new vehicle. If you go, and I should qualify, a luxury or a high-end brand new ICE vehicle, they're going to use extremely high quality and high grade steels, and in some cases aluminum, but principally steels and exhaust systems, so as to mitigate this from happening, right? You can see how much corrosion has occurred over a short amount of time, and you know, it's probably debatable as to whether or not this will even fully get out of warranty. It's probably just skimping by based on what we're seeing here. Moving a little bit further rearward in the vehicle, again, very inexpensive rear suspension system. It's a twist beam, essentially. So there is no separate stabilizer bar. There is no coil over shock system with multiple links going out to knuckles or anything like that. It's pretty self-contained in this cross member, which is considered a twist beam or a twist blade. Some people will refer to it as. So it's stamped steel weldment primarily, and then on the inside here of this little U section, you can see a steel tube, right? So this steel tube runs the width of the twist beam. It's actually kind of a interesting application. And then at the ends of the twist beam, we're seeing that tube come out the outboard sides right here, right? So there's the edge of the tube. And so they're probably getting a lot more torsional rigidity out of the whole member just by doing that. Now, very inexpensive, but it's not going to perform nearly as well as some of the other suspension systems that are truly independent, right? Every time this wheel goes up, it's going to want to raise both wheels, right? It's going to do some different things, and it doesn't do so as eloquently as, say, a multi-link rear suspension that you would see on a Tesla or a BMW or Mercedes, something of that nature. I was actually just under here a few moments ago looking at this with my boss, Scott Hildreth, and he pointed this out immediately when we got back here. So it's this little like claw tooth stamping that I'm highlighting with the laser pointer. At first glance, or I guess to the untrained eye, you would say, well, it's not connected to anything. It looks just weird and out of place. Well, what that actually is number one, I think kind of a band-aid, right? So it's a way to get around a problem that they're having during an impact event. But if you look at the entire package, you've got a spare tire here, and then forward of the spare tire, you've got the fuel tank. Well, in a rear impact event, you need to protect the fuel tank as much as possible. In this vehicle, from a rear impact perspective, you're not really worried about the occupants just because you've got so much distance and structure between the rear end of the vehicle and the occupants. But in this case, when you've got a fuel tank to protect, you don't want this wheel, if you remember when I was talking about stack up at the beginning, you don't want this wheel to run into the fuel tank because that could cause a thermal event or a fire. So that bracket, the one with the notches in it, they're using to puncture the tire so that they gain, I would estimate, roughly 100 millimeters of free crush space on both sides of the tire during the impact event. So they're buying themselves more time to allow the primary structural rails to do their job and to protect that fuel tank ultimately. And that may be the case with this bracket as well. It's really odd. I'm actually not sure, right? One potential could be that it's protecting the exhaust from getting close to the fuel tank during an impact event. The other option would be if you got the all-wheel drive version, for example, maybe it's a connection there, but it's actually not connected to anything on the vehicle that we got. So I guess curious is what I would call that bracket. And as I had mentioned, all-wheel drive, right? There is an all-wheel drive option. The all-wheel drive option is probably one of the primary drivers as to why they needed that bracket, that little chunked out bracket that I was talking about for the tire, because that's going to be one of those monuments that's going to drive into the fuel tank ultimately. It's very possible it's not even required on a front-wheel drive version of this vehicle, but they leave it in place so as to not induce more complexity in the system. So overall, very interesting vehicle. I've been wanting to get under one of these for a little while now. It's to no surprise, looking at the sticker price on this vehicle, starting out at around $20,000. Looking at some of the selections they made, that's what you have to do if you want to be able to sell a vehicle to the consumers starting out at that base price. That being said, it's very possible that Ford may not even be able to make a profit specifically on that base level trim, because although, yes, they're saving costs in a lot of areas, these vehicles are incredibly expensive. We've got a battery pack. There's different things that are extremely expensive regardless. So if you're a big company like Ford, you can do stuff like that. It's harder to do if you're a startup like Rivian, for example. They have to price the vehicle such that they can hopefully at least break even, but a lot of companies don't even do that. They're losing money on every vehicle they sell. So I hope it was informative. I hope it gave you a little bit more insight as to how the Maverick was inexpensive. So join us next time, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thank you.